Thank you for making it through the day. Good afternoon. I'm J.C. Cannon. Today, during this session, I'm going to talk about the Microsoft Privacy Development Standard. Now, through this presentation, I might call it the standard or Microsoft Privacy Standard, but they all refer to the same document, which you all have a copy of in your packet that was sent out this morning. Following the agenda that was actually sent to us, I'm going to first talk about the problem we're trying to solve, which is building privacy-aware applications at Microsoft. Next, I'm going to talk about the privacy standard itself, how it came into being, and how we're going to use this to help solve this problem of creating privacy-aware applications. Next, we're going to look at how it actually fits in the organization, meaning how we're going to deploy this thing. Hopefully, with a lot of your feedback, you can actually give us some guidance on that. And then we're going to talk about specific questions and how to move forward using this standard. So today, if you look around Microsoft and how we build products, there's only a few groups that are really focusing on doing the right things with regards to privacy. Windows, of course, is the leader, I guess, around Microsoft with their own director of privacy, Jeffrey Friedberg. They have their own Windows privacy standard. And Office comes in a very close second with their Office privacy standard, and it's led by Colin Birch right there. There's also a couple other groups like Digital Media Division, MSN, Microsoft.com, that also have formal standards around privacy. However, there are many more teams at Microsoft that aren't quite getting the message just yet. Today, there are some groups doing privacy reviews, but sort of ad hoc by themselves in a vacuum without doing the right things. And even if you look at one organization where there may be several teams working on privacy reviews, they're doing different kinds of things, unfortunately. So if you ask them if they did a privacy review, the answer means different things. Also, in the end, there's no formal sign-off. So when a product ships, you can't be assured that they did the right things with regards to privacy. And that's something we're working on, and the privacy standard is going to lead into this sign-off process that I'll talk about during this presentation. So understanding the problem of building consistent privacy-aware applications across Microsoft, the privacy standard is here to help fulfill our goal of building these applications and services across Microsoft in a consistent and trusted fashion. We also want to consolidate the different privacy standards that exist today. For example, the Windows privacy standard, the Office privacy standard, the standards done by the Microsoft.com and MSN teams. And once this is deployed, hopefully it will fill the void or that need to have standards around privacy. So the roadmap is starting, of course, with the creation. We spent a painful 9 months actually hammering this out. And let me tell you, the first few meetings, just trying to figure out what is means, it was very painful for us. I'm sure if any of you have been involved in creating standards, you understand the pain with just trying to agree on certain terminology. The creation of the privacy standard was being run by Corporate Privacy Group, and I am the representative for this particular team. In Office, we had Colin Birch, who participated right there. We also had Legal with Sue Gluck. The MSN representative is Diane McDade. Jeffrey Friedberg, of course, is from Windows, taking the information or the knowledge he gained from Digital Media Division, moving it to the Windows division, and then eventually we're actually going to use that information to build the Microsoft privacy standard. So now that we've got the first draft completed, we're actually going to send this to Peter's Privacy Management Council, also to all of you, hoping that you'll give us feedback on the standard itself. And then we're also going to present this to the executives of the various product groups for adoption by their teams. Once we get this validation and do whatever necessary updates we need to do, we're going to push this out to all the product groups across Microsoft. Now, there's many teams at Microsoft that don't build products, but we're really focusing on teams that build products commercially. Not line of business applications, but applications that are sold to consumers and businesses. Although I only have 4 boxes here, this is actually representing all product groups across Microsoft. So when we decided to create this privacy standard, we of course wanted to follow the philosophies within our corporate privacy standard, or corporate privacy policy, which is in our privacy handbook, which is online here. We also wanted to operationalize our PD3 philosophy, which is privacy in design, privacy by default, and privacy in deployment. And we also want to, of course, at the end of this, talk about that particular framework to see if it still is valid today. And as I mentioned before, it includes the work that was done by many teams across Microsoft who spent time doing research around privacy, and of course, we want to take advantage of that. And of course, it embraces the 7 safe harbor privacy principles: notice, choice, onward transfer, data integrity, security, enforcement, and so on. The way the document is organized is to give the developer, program manager, or the other members of the development teams an easy way to understand what to do when they're building products. We start off with data classifications to help them understand what is privacy and what are the different pieces of a privacy review. Now, if you look at the document itself, the first few pages just talk about generalization of privacy, where to get more information, for example, how to find a privacy handbook. Data classification is very important because people want to understand, how do I treat certain types of data? So in order to understand how to treat it, you need to understand how to classify it. So we have 3 main categories: anonymous, PII, and sensitive PII. We describe types of notice and consent. We also indicate how that differs from choice and disclosure documents. We have types of privacy controls, controls for individuals to protect their own privacy, controls for administrators to permit them to protect the privacy of their enterprises, and also controls to help parents protect the privacy of their families. We discussed data minimization, which is about minimizing the data you collect, minimizing the data you store, and over time. So even though you collect a lot of information about a user today, you may not need that 3 months or 3 years from now. And also minimizing data that we share internally and externally. So in general, someone calls you up and says, do you have information on account XYZ? Instead of giving them the keys to the database, we only send them information they need for the request that they made. And also we explain exception processing. Of course, as you're doing a privacy analysis, there's going to be exceptions to the rule. And so we explain exactly how the exception process works. Now, the remainder of this document focuses on how to perform a privacy analysis. It starts off with the basic privacy analysis. We don't want to overburden people if they have a simple application. For example, if your application is Notepad, there's not a whole lot to do as far as the privacy analysis. You're not collecting information, you're not sending anything to the internet. And so in general, what you want to do is say, I did my privacy review, I'm going to provide my privacy disclosure, which is I don't collect, store, or share any information, and then you're done with that, except for waiting for your sign-off. If you've done the basic privacy analysis and determined that you do collect information and you need to do a detailed analysis, then we get into the actual detailed process, which is first determining, based on what your component does and how it's used, whether or not it's a client, server, or service component. Then you look at the particular data flow that you are actually responsible for within that component, whether you're sending information to someone else, you're storing it locally, sharing with the component, or so on. And based on that data flow analysis, you go directly to the rules, which explain step by step the things that you need to do to be compliant for that particular data flow. Now let's look at how that actually works in practice. So I'm a developer, program manager, tester, whatever, and I'm going to start off with a basic analysis of my component, or the feature that I'm responsible for within my component. And so the first thing I ask is, do I process personal data at all? If I don't understand, of course, the first section of the document should help me understand that. If the answer is no, then all I need to do is sign off the privacy review and provide any privacy disclosure that's necessary for that component. If the answer is yes, then I move to the detailed analysis phase. For this phase, let's pretend that I'm responsible for the Windows error reporting feature. So in this dialog, I look at it and says, well, this is a client component since it runs on the computer system and interacts with the user. And so I pick client component to do my detailed analysis piece. And the next thing I do is I look at the diagram and try to figure out, amongst these data flows, which one represents my data flow? And as I look, I see a data flow where my component shares information with Microsoft. That's me. And that's item number C on this list. And so now I go to the rules for sharing data with Microsoft. Now the rule is 6.3. It starts off with features that transfer data from the user's computer must first do this list of things. And this is for all applications or features that share information outside the user's computer. Now if you look at the sub-bullet, it says, now if beyond that you share information with Microsoft, then you must also follow these other rules. Now once you've done this, you've actually done everything you need to do for a data flow for a client component. Now you may also have to comply with another data flow. So just because you picked one data flow doesn't mean that you don't have to do the review for another type of data flow. So now that we've got this standard completed, we're going to look at how we're going to actually operationalize this. As I said before, the privacy development standard was built off of the privacy handbook, which is our policy or corporate policy around privacy at Microsoft. After the completion, we actually thought of things that weren't in the privacy handbook, but does apply to development of products. And we're going to actually move some of that stuff back into the privacy handbook, thus for benefiting from the information that we gain during this process. One of the things we're doing is updating the glossary. There's a lot of new concepts that came out of this standard creation that we're going to add to the glossary, so people who are reading the privacy handbook understand these new concepts. From the privacy development standard, we're going to drive content for the engineering excellence guide. We're also going to be part of the software development lifecycle. I know you've been hearing a lot about the security development lifecycle, but once we add privacy to it, it's going to become the software development lifecycle, or the trust lifecycle, if you will. So this is going to lead into, or actually extend, the software development lifecycle. It's also going to be driven into the product groups to help them understand how to build privacy-aware applications. And what I mean by privacy-aware applications is applications that help protect the privacy of the user as they use them. So they're not specifically applications like an encryption technology that protects users, but it's applications that you use every day, such as Office Word or Excel or Windows Media Player. As you use this application, there are the settings there to help you protect your data and help you protect your right to be left alone. Now once we get the validation here, it'll move into the Checkpoint Express process, which is the sign-off for products at Microsoft. At least we're moving into it. Several groups are using it today, and we plan to roll this out to all product groups. So before you sign off or can you ship your product, you've said that you comply with all of the privacy rules within the privacy standard. Now here's the Engineering Excellence Guide. Now this is an overview for all developers, for all areas of product development, to help them understand what they need to do during various phases of the product development cycle, and also based on what their role is. If you look at the left-hand side of the pane, this area here indicates the current cycle that you're in within your product. Here is where you select what your current role is. And when you select these two things, you get a different set of tasks that you have to complete in order to build your product in compliance with our engineering guide. Now once you've actually completed all the things in the Engineering Excellence Guide and completed your product, you come to the Checkpoint Express site to actually sign off on every area of compliance within Microsoft. And this is corporate as well as regulatory compliance. So if you look at the list, you see we have geopolitical, privacy, compliance engineering, and so on. So before you ship your product, you have to click on checkboxes underneath these to say that you've done all the things necessary for each one of these areas. So we're going to look at the privacy area. If you open up the privacy section, you notice there's 3 checkboxes there. It starts off by saying, my product does provide a privacy disclosure, either through a privacy statement or some other dialogue or text that ships with my product. Secondly, if I send information to Microsoft, I received express consent from the user. And thirdly, if I send information to a third party who's not acting as an agent, I've also, once again, received express consent from the user. So today we've actually finished with the first draft. But there are some things that we still need to do. As I mentioned before, we need to actually integrate this into the software development lifecycle. So instead of doing separate security and privacy reviews, we're doing one single trust review. We also need to make sure that the deployment process fits in with the way people do business here. For example, do we actually have one privacy standard that we push out to everyone? And as product groups see small changes they need to make, do they make changes to the privacy standard, or do they create extensions themselves that they use separately from the Microsoft privacy standard? We also need to add specific topics to this. Right now we covered the core things that people need to do around privacy, but we haven't covered things like RFID or location-based services. So this is where you really come in. Please take some time to read through the Microsoft Privacy Standard. You should have a soft copy of this. If you open it up, turn on track changes, and just edit the things that you want to actually send back to us, and then send that to me or David Ladd so we understand what the true feedback is. Also, there's specific questions that we've asked right here that we'd like your feedback on. One is the PD3 privacy framework, is it still compliant? Does it actually look right? Do you have any feedback on what we're saying here about privacy and design by default and in deployment? Is the flow to standard? Does it make sense to you? Before we talked about the Windows privacy standard, you mentioned that there were things missing, it wasn't complete. But as far as I know, we didn't get actual specifics on that. So we would love to get specifics on where we need to improve this Microsoft privacy standard. Are we covering the right topics? Is there something missing? How do we adapt the standard over time? I mean, do you have suggestions on how we can actually get this pushed out internally? Should we actually look at doing it externally? And once again, should the product groups add to this or create their own extensions? You've been awful quiet, and that is it.
Well, they were told to keep quiet.
Oh, now you're going to start.
There was a 20-minute moratorium. Yeah.
Eugene, UCLA, always good to hear from you.
So one thing that I thought was missing, I read through it.
Thank you.
Pardon?
Thank you for reading it.
Yeah, I did.
Anybody else read it? All right.
So there was this discussion of features that store user data in a data storage micro.
Yes.
And there were several. Well, actually, I have no idea how many. But there were one is just memory dump. When we check that nice send error report box. And
Yes.
there is MSN, and I think it also Hotmail. And I imagine there will be others too.
Yes, there are many.
Pardon?
There are many.
Yeah, but I guess MSN, for example, just strikes me as especially potentially vulnerable. That a Jennifer Lopez is an MSN user, she's got to use sometime. And she sends somebody an email about her love life. And if somebody was a Microsoft sees it, that's a great reputation just to the next cocktail party or the next choir or something.
I get the impression there's a question in there.
Yes. I think so far you can guess what the question is. What I didn't really see is what's the kind of the personnel, the human resources dimension. How is it that what's the Microsoft general policy about making sure that trustworthy data that's turned over not just the Microsoft products but the Microsoft people, trustworthy, the private data is actually private?
Well, I'll talk about the generalization of it, and then Diane may want to talk about MSN specifically. But in general, any information that we're collecting on customers, partners, or any other companies, we actually try to keep in a protected store, in a data center. All right, restricted access, and then you have to actually read the access requirements and then say you read them, and then you get access for a specific purpose. Of course, it's difficult to enforce that they have the right purpose, they didn't lie about it. But in general, we do have practices in place to help protect that information. Now, I'd like Diane to respond to the MSN piece, if she would.
Sure. I think you're really asking about the security that we put around the data and the controls around personnel access to the data. And we have a leader locking environment over at MSN for security and people together. And so I can answer your question a lot of different ways, but just so you have a sort of big picture, there's a required privacy and security training in all individuals in the entire network. For those individuals who have access to PII data, we have a more advanced required security training program. Right now, it's being modeled on the passport incentive training and security program, the ISP program that was rolled out for the passport properties last year. I don't know if you all know we had a very strict set of requirements on the passport service around security in the last year or so. What we've done is we've taken that security program, which we've probably discussed at another time in another meeting, and we're now implementing that across all of our entire MSN service. So the short answer is anybody who has any access to PII, whether it's Trevor Lopez or mine or yours, is going through and has a whole set of requirements they need to respond to as private keys, and it's not an optional sort of activity. Teams are going through required classroom training, and it's specialized for the different job functions. But access control is really what we're talking about. I believe people have the right to get access. And when it comes to email and actually reading the contents of the email, it's strictly prohibited. And frankly, except for the case when we get a law enforcement request, or if we believe there's a life-threatening situation, no one ever looks at the email. It's not like an activity that we Pardon me?
But no sysadmin that have access to the file, or except for troubleshooters.
Around reading those is very, very tight. They just aren't very circumstances. The spam filtering team gets samples of that with users' consent and permission to help do research on that. That's also very strictly controlled. I could get you more details on this, but it's very, very tight.
But you just want to, let me just sort of answer kind of, I think, where you're going, well, why wasn't it in standard? And Diane's making a really good point that what I think organizations try and do is figure out, well, what's the purpose of this document, the standard, and how does it relate to others? So in addition to security requirements, there's also human resources requirements and standards of business conduct that have very specific consequences if you don't meet certain standards. So obviously, the case of somebody that willfully accessed customer information and then willfully disclosed it, likely the remedy would be terminated. I suspect the suit would talk a little bit about the human resources side of it. Down that road, there's a very different and very clear set of standards that are in a different process of different countries.
But they're kind of on a department by department. Microsoft networks will have one, others have
No.
Or is there a another Microsoft privacy scanning that covers that, like this one covers?
No, and let's start out with human resources as a company-wide set of standards that all employees must abide by if they acknowledge it.
Is it code of ethics?
Code of ethics, there are rules, there's just a host of things that we're bound by. They're not business specific, they're not Microsoft-wide.
Did,
I'd like to see even more stuff. There's stuff referenced in here, but I was really impressed. That doesn't mean the right thing.
no, I would like to get your feedback on that.
Yeah. And this is a basic concept, right? Start with this notion of empowering customers and respecting customers' rights to let alone. And the things that are missing are kind of those, data stewardship obligations, which I think are somewhat picked up in your data governance documents and on that side. But, you don't really talk about, or you talk about in different sections of this document, integrity, data integrity, you talk about access, controls, you audit bonds, but none of those things are reflected in this initial basic concept.
Yes, in that section.
And so I think, there's a lot more to what's embedded in deeper sections of your privacy that aren't actually reflected in that basic concept section. And so I think one of the things that happens is that some of it is really strong in certain sections, but it's not consistent in the rest of it. But I think you're underselling it.
Yeah, one of the things we try to stay away from.
The integration. Integrate the documents and make them really cohesive, but it's not really clear to them.
Yeah, a lot of the concepts you're talking about are in the privacy handbook, and we wanted to get away from reproducing that text. And so I'm sure in the first paragraph we talk about if you're new to privacy, then start off with reading the privacy handbook. And we didn't want to reproduce that information if possible. But if there are concepts specific to, I guess, this area, which is product development, that you think are missing, we'd be happy to add those.
Well, it may be that I need to look at the privacy handbook, I don't know.
We'd be happy to send you a copy.
Sure.
So we'll get that to all of you. Peter? Oh, I'm sorry. Is there someone before him?
I guess I know open source isn't the popular term around here, but I was talking to somebody at IBM about the process of putting things into Linux, and she thought that it actually made things better, all the eyes looking at it and negotiating and stuff. So I guess that was the question you asked, the question I was wondering too, is what's the downside of making, at some time, the publishing of a privacy document public and getting
Now you're talking about like this standard?
is the privacy handbook public?
No.
Sue, do you want to answer that one? The downsides?
Well, there must be some downside. There are lots.
Well, there,
What?
That Microsoft is doing litigation market, and we're cautious about dealing with digital policies without reason. And there's another reason that's in some ways more interesting. I find that I hear a lot from the field requests from customers to see our policies because they just want to adopt our policies for quality. When we're uniquely situated with the kind of products that we develop, and our policies probably wouldn't fit any other company strictly. So I wonder about the kind of guidance we give to other people, and if just giving them our own policies is the right way to go, or instead to work on something out a little bit more generic.
Well, I mean, other maybe Pollyannish view is that Microsoft is the leader of this industry. Leadership and demonstrate that it takes privacy serious steps that it's taking, both general and specific development process to try to ensure privacy. I can see that as a benefit to our industry if Microsoft can do that.
Hey, let me give you where our thinking on kind of not just this policy, but other things around privacy. I think in meetings done in the past, we've overviewed the way that we approach the internal assessment, the ASAP process, and we kind of think that has potentially some value to customers very, very broadly. In other words, not everybody develops software, but most companies have some internal applications being reviewed for security and privacy. So we've wrestled with how do we make it more white label to deal with Sue's question that that it's designed for a Microsoft environment, a Microsoft audience. That's not necessarily doesn't necessarily translate across organizations, but obviously large parts of it do. So we had that on the docket for this year to translate that one. It didn't make the budget line, primarily because to date there hasn't been a huge customer demand. Arguably we haven't asked, and we're in the process of doing that with particularly government funds. But I would see that one being of more value to business in general than standards. However, I'm not dismissing what you're saying. There would be some value to that. there's another line of thought which I think is an interesting one to ponder over. In Canada right now, under JCT1, there's an initiative about can we create privacy standards around a set of common criteria? The industry is also thinking about just how mature is this space, and if you start to sort of develop hard and rigorous standards, what can happen? I think we've seen some examples of that in the RFID space already in terms of legislation. We've certainly seen examples of it in the kind of spyware. The Utah bill is a prime example of that, just where the space isn't all that mature. So,
standards and legislation are viewable. Saying those are the same thing?
well, legislation in some respects does attempt to set a standard around things. So
I thought earlier we heard testimony that the benefits to the industry doing something against legislation. And that might be an argument to think about, that if you don't want to do it by yourselves, it may be important for the industry to try and agree on standards, because otherwise laws can figure out what the standards are going to be for you.
Yeah. Fair comment.
Now, we have presented our philosophy around privacy development at Microsoft with several public audiences, PDC, TCAAB, various privacy conferences, but we've stopped short of actually sharing the standard documents in privacy handbook.
I think that's a concrete question.
One comment and then a question. The comment picks up on that, and it might have been answered by Peter Cullen. The federal government now has requirements for privacy impact assessments for new computer systems. If they're buying Microsoft products, shown that the products have been done consistent with a set of standards, and they turn out to be an easy way to prove to federal agencies that the compliance has been done. That might be a reason to consider going forward and saying we've already met this. So that's the comment. The comment question part is, I don't see in here any discussion of legal looking at products as they're produced to see to what extent they make it easy to comply with various laws. So for medical data, how easy is this going to make it to comply with HIPAA? When you're inside Europe, it's not just the safe harbor, but it's the full European directive. There's a lot of legal rules besides COPPA, which you listed there in the world, that exist right now. And I wonder whether part of the process of development is being able to see whether the software is being done in a way that makes it straightforward to implement legal requirements.
One of the things that is difficult is as you talked about, there's so many regions, so many regulatory requirements, internationally. It's hard to actually pick and choose, but we're actually trying to do something at the core that's going to help us be compliant with, I guess, the majority of them, if that makes any sense. So if you look at what we're doing around notice and choice, if you collect information, you tell the user. To me, that's a basic concept. And if we can actually do that part of it, if you're sending anything outside the computer system, if you're storing it, try to encrypt it. If you're transmitting something that's sensitive, try to encrypt that, so on and so forth. Now, to us, that sort of leads towards that compliance without indicating all the international regulatory requirements in the document itself. But there are specific things, for example, around COPPA that you have to do if you're targeting any applications towards children. Now, we could add if you're doing something around HIPAA or Gramm-Leach-Bliley or Sarbanes-Oxley, but they tend to fall in the category of notice and choice.
Well, and audit requirements under HIPAA and so on. It's just something that was sort of interesting to see. There was no looking to see about compliance with applicable laws that was visible from the document.
Yeah, part of the process of shipping this out is doing an international review. So we send out a beta to our subsidiaries to say, this is the product we're planning on shipping to your region. How do you feel about this in regards to privacy?
Ira, Sue, is there a standard that the product shipped must go through the sign-off from LCA?
There isn't an official one, but informally, all the products that I support, I see everything before it goes out. So, and when you're looking at industry solutions, about questions about how to do that. In this standard, so much of our product is really not industry
Now, Peter, the Checkpoint Express process does help ensure that they're doing the right things with regards to regulatory requirements. So things that do affect us in general as far as shipping products should be listed here on this website.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, but I think that to put words in Peter's mouth, if I read the must conform to regulatory requirements, but I'm in a product group and I'm not aware that there may be some particular HIPAA requirements, why would I ask? I assume there aren't any. So I'm wondering if maybe we can put some sort of stronger reference to that we need to get a formal legal review to make sure that all regulatory requirements are being met.
And I think getting it early enough, so in the insurance express, they actually either not having a privacy statement or having a privacy statement. Either way, they do want to come to a legal department. But at that point, the horse is almost running out the barn. So I think that's great feedback to make sure that our looking back to themselves.
My question is the same as Peter's, but I guess now I'm more confused than I was before Peter asked my question, which is,
Peter's fault?
yeah, I'm really going to blame Peter for that. I just what is currently the practice with regard to, particularly thinking outside the United States, but inside the U.S. or outside, with clients with privacy laws on a product or service basis? We're going to roll out X. Is there a separate or special privacy legal compliance review? Is there a group legal compliance?
Well, that's why we're all here today, is we're trying to actually standardize the privacy review.
I mean, to be clear, all I asked is what is currently the practice. In other words, not the future or not what our hopes are. Today, when SP2 ships, who will have looked at that to say, is this compliant?
Okay, for the major product groups at Microsoft, there is a formal privacy review process. They also go through the checkpoint process that you saw here. So, for example, when we were going to ship Office 11, the previous version, Office 2003, was it called? It went through a privacy review locally, and we also sent it to the subs to look at, and they gave us some critical feedback that helped us ensure shipping internationally.
Let me answer your question a different way. Most products, services are produced, certainly made once in the U.S. In Redmond. Most product and service groups had some form of privacy review, some of it very formalized. The roots of this was the Windows one, which we had presented before. Others were less formal. So this was an attempt to standardize the process and standardize the standards more than anything else.
And so I guess what I'm getting at, I don't know anybody is critical. I also, like Deidre, maybe even more so, thought the document looked terrific. I could go on for some time about the nice things I thought about it.
Oh, do so.
I know how short of time we are. But I guess one of the things that it seems to be sort of a constant problem, not for Microsoft, for the world at large, is the difference between sort of complying with privacy laws, which often lead to actually worse privacy protection, and really thinking about privacy leadership and privacy issues and trying to make those part of the process. And it seems like you're really doing the second here, which is how do we do what we really care about privacy. Yet often, I mean, it's not unusual, let me say, for someone who really cares about privacy to nevertheless find themselves violating, a law. You mail out your notices on the wrong color paper, and suddenly you're. And I'm wondering how those two processes would work together. I guess I'm a certain suspicion as to whether they can work together.
I have been responsive and one of the things that I've seen is that lawyers and policy people speak one language, and developers and technical another language.
We've seen it in TCAAB sometimes.
And I think that for those of us who are in the policy space and privacy space, we needed a long time to have some way to translate legal requirements without teaching people what the law is itself. We don't want them to be many lawyers, and so it is a very difficult thing. And I think this document is an attempt to do that in a way that is consistent with us. That's why it took us 8 months, because we had such different perspectives coming in, and I think that what you hit on is the key problem, because we want to
simple instructions about privacy, you can do it. The reality is I've always contended that privacy is unfortunately a judgment call in many cases, and it's effective, and that's why we have privacy cabinet, social media, privacy people, we kind of debate some of these things and we try to get down to the essence of doing the right thing. Bring up the exact touch point where this comes into play. For example, automatic update, I think is a great example. We might have simply followed our regulation, our own practices around it, but we realized how sensitive this topic would be to certain constituents, say in Europe. And having to deal with the international component only came into play when we knew, number one, we were in the process, so we were able to at least interject our opinion at the right moment in time. And then we had great debates about should we pre-check the boxes or not, should we do that, We have high-level concepts of notice of choice, but when it comes down to it, it's what you see on that screen more than not the EU or somebody's going to take it wrong. So we had lawyers and various people who represent us in the privacy cabinet sitting in meetings with, our company debating how this was going to work. And it wasn't straightforward. It was not something you could get from a document. What I'm happy is that we had a process that allowed that to happen. So I think there's really two parts of it, I guess what I'm saying. That you're not going to find us trying to educate people and making them employers. But we do want a process where our good judgment and experience can come to bear at those key moments with this high sensitive issues. And we can float the cream to the top.
Just one last thing to the point. The other thing is that I'd like to believe, and I can actually cite examples where our policies and standards are higher than the legal standards because we build support for our customers. And so sometimes it's important to think about those two constructs together as opposed to trying to separate them, if that makes sense.
Well, exactly. I'd say, 4/5 of this document or more would be beyond what any law would require in the United States anyway. Just to add, I appreciate those responses, and just sort of one final brief comment, and then I'll shut up. Which is, I also could imagine adding this to security review is an additional complexity. Since security might lead you in a different direction on some of these issues, the updates being a good example, where from a security point of view, you might say, of course, we're going to make the default of automatic updates. Privacy law might hold you back, and privacy principle, I frankly don't know where it would sort of show up there. So it seems to me a very impressive, significant step for perhaps.
Ira, you had a statement?
Yeah, I just had one other comment. From an operational standpoint, when document goes over, we know the requirements of business testing. Not from the business of selling products. The best that we can do is have an document like this that educates developers on the kinds of issues that they need to think about. Then we have two checks. One is front-on product owner, who knows enough about privacy to spawn an issue, and then reverse IP and then we have Sue and several other lawyers assigned to different product teams in the company. So through that interaction, through Sue looks at her client, she knows what they're doing, they know what to look for. And she says, oh, you may have an additional issue around top or around tip. But to hand out tip the top, we're not in tip, we're not in top. That's how we're doing it. That's the answer. I don't see it. Unless we were in those markets.
Right, so that the ultimate question of legal compliance is still left with lawyers, but that this is much more designed on the broader principle level and on sensitizing people so they raise the issues.
Can you speak up just a sec?
Pardon?
Can you speak up?
Yeah, I know that the automatic update issue is a particular concern in the EU and in Turkey. And I wonder the operational level, how does any kind of particular international flavor of a privacy concern get translated? In fact, you read that most of the products are being developed, so that becomes part of the development process.
Yeah, we have not done a particularly good job of that in the past, and as a result, we've had kind of a less than a half hour, screening what we have done and are still in the process of formalizing is that a member of my team focuses exclusively on international markets and is building a product feedback loop into the development cycle so that the right people in the international world have a chance to take a look at the design before it's at shipping date to make sure that some of those nuances are particularly dealt with. Ira, do you want to talk about the auto update Germany thing? Because I think that's kind of a pretty interesting.
This is a quick feedback as my initial comment I don't know if you have anybody on the privacy side looking at a regular basis at the annual reports of data protection commissioners, whether in Germany or others. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, so we have at least one person on my team here in the in rare instances, we actually we usually try to find a sweet spot.
In reviewing different annual reports of data protection officials, and frequently in Germany, I'll find something very specific in terms of a right or a prediction or a warning in a data protection report, let's say from the Hessen Data Protection Commission. Maybe a player in this particular space, and he was saying this is a Microsoft product, really quite specifically in the government. I'm worried about it.
And often we respond to that by going up.
Let's go.
First, I'd like to second what everybody said about the statewide document.
Thank you.
I also like to second the suggestion that it final reasons be made public. I think all the reasons that people already said. But in addition, I think as a professor who teaches a privacy course, I would love to be able to use this in my class. I teach computer science students who are going to become software developers that you might hire someday. And it would be really great to be able to use this as an example. So I hope you will make it public. If you decide not to, I hope you will at least consider making a sanitized version of it available.
You know, Lori, I think we can commit to that. How do you feel about that, Scott?
You know, I don't see why we couldn't. I mean, it gets scrubbed to the different, levels. I think
Sue? I like. Lori, we might get you a copy before you leave. No.
I mean, to some extent, like the SDL document that, Steve and Michael Howard and I are co-writing have been working on, very much designed for publication. And part of the theory about much of this is because Microsoft has been very vocal about the fact that it's not enough for us to do this. And then as an industry leader, we really need to get other people to do it as well. And so our approach in publishing, writing secure code, threat modeling book, putting pre-fast and WIDBE, it's all designed to move the industry as a whole. And so, I'm not adverse to it. Obviously, it raises some, obvious issues about what you claim to be prescriptive and mandatory versus a best practice. You don't want to say you're doing things that you're not. At the same time, internally you can have documents that are suitably and appropriately aspirational, and you can work to move the company to deploy them. But if you've ever been in a big organization to suggest that overnight you get 100% compliance is just not true. And so, as you start publishing this stuff, you raise expectations. You want to make sure that if you're claiming to do something, you actually have the kind of compliance you're talking about.
I just got to add this. I mean, with an organization of this size, it's not clear what the best vehicle is to communicate with. I mean, it might be New York Times.
No.
Or something.
That would be wrong.
But it's, if it's out there in the public and this is what you're supposed to be doing, then that helps increase it. But the other thing, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it sure seems to me that you guys, if you get sued, this stuff's going to get discovered, right? So, what do you? I'm not quite sure what you're saving by keeping it private, given that you have to.
Well, that doesn't actually work. On that theory, you could say every internal document of every company should be published in the New York Times, because ultimately, if you're sued, it might be discovered. It just doesn't work that way.
Okay. Well, I like what you said earlier about leadership and.
Yeah.
If you want to somehow, there's words in there that you take out, you feel more comfortable with, and it has most of what's in here, I don't think that matters.
So for obvious reasons, before we publish documents like the SDL document or this document, we always send it to IRA in this book. Because it doesn't help at the end of the day if you just expose yourself to more lawsuits and liability and other things, because then it just makes it harder in the future to keep pumping out that kind of leadership.
Yeah, Laura, when we talk afterwards about your plans, I'd love to hear about it. Yes.
A question, do you plan to beta test this with actual developers?
Well, I wouldn't call it beta test, but we actually plan to deploy it.
Well, no, what I'm thinking is before you give it to like all of your thousands of developers, that you give it to a small number of them and have them work through it on a real product and see if it makes sense to them.
Well, we're already doing that to a certain extent in the Windows, Office, MSN, and Microsoft.com. Now, we're actually going to have this period where we actually move from their specific standards to the Microsoft standard to see how well that works, and then deploy it to the rest of the groups at Microsoft. So that's, and yeah, we're not going to try to send it to 55,000 people at once. Where I can see what works locally with a few groups and then migrate it out.
Okay, a few other comments. Another one is, in your discussion of notice here, you might want to mention P3P.
That's fine.
But really, you talk about notice, and in some ways, as you've already discussed, sometimes notice and usability you have this conflict, and it's just when things take too often and you just watch it away. And computer-readable notice may be a solution to some types of problems, and I think it should be mentioned as an option for developers to consider when it comes to appropriate.
Diane, do you know if P3P was mentioned at all in the services section?
No, it's not in there. And it's an area that we can put on our list.
And I would consider it beyond the services section. I think you may find it has utility to use P3P for beyond what W3C intended P3P for. It may have wider utility in
So are you saying that, for example, Office would have it as part of its applications? What are you thinking?
well, we can talk some details later, but basically, P3P provides a framework for describing privacy in the computer-readable format. And wherever you in your product need to provide some sort of notice to the user, using the P3P framework may actually help you provide notice to the user.
Well, you should reference it for another reason other than it already is standard that any website that must have a P3P policy, contact policy.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just saying.
I know there's a disconnect within Microsoft as far as developers knowing about P3P. So, for example, while the browser people, or some of them, actually know about it, there are people who work on, say, a mail client who face some of the same issues. They make email and cookies and maybe people working on the mail client don't know anything about P3P. Where they may actually make some sense of using it in their platform.
Yeah, we certainly talk about P3P in relation to delivering anything that's accessible by a browser. But if you talk about just client applications, we tend not to talk about it. And you're right about that. Okay.
Okay, my last point has to do with, this looks really nice on paper, but it seems that in order to be really effective, you're actually going to need to devote more resources, more development resources to privacy. And I've had the opportunity to see firsthand kind of how it is used in the browser and the development process there. And one of the things I observed is that very often the developers would say, yeah, we'd really like to do this and this, and yes, we agree it would be better for privacy, but it's really a hard thing to implement, and we just don't have the kind of resources to do it the right way. So we're going to do it this way, and yes, we know it's not quite good for privacy, but that's the best we can do.
I have to push back a little bit. Let's take a delivery example where a person's collecting some information on the desktop and then sending it across the internet to Microsoft, and it has sensitive information. Now, if they're saying, oh, we're too busy to encrypt the data, that's just not a good answer for us.
Well,
Now, I don't think we need more developers per se, but we may need to push out the timelines in order to make sure that we do the right things around privacy.
More developers or more hours per developer, either way.
Yeah.
But I mean, just looking at the way P3P was implemented in IE6, and the developers involved, agree with me that it's kind of a lousy implementation. But given the amount of time and effort that they had to put into it, that was sort of the best that they could do.
Now, yeah, P3P is a new concept that you're building, but when we're talking about the way people build products today, if you collect information, there should be a privacy setting to be able to turn on and off. That should be happening anyway.
Right, so let me give you,
Yeah.
give you another example, get away from P3P. So, for example, look at the web browser, the kinds of, when it sends referrer fields and things like that. Okay, so this it came up in the P3P discussion as well, but it's not directly P3P. So, according to your guidelines here, if we go to data minimization, we have to think about whether we really want to always send the referrer field and things like that. Now, the browser people have pointed out to us that while the privacy-sensitive thing to do may be just always suppress it, that may break things. And it may require us to think about, really changing a lot of stuff if we want to make sure that we keep a consistent user experience while suppressing that sort of information. And that's a whole thing that they weren't prepared to jump into and figure out because that's a lot of work, right? If this is adopted, what should happen is that the IT should go and do that work and figure out if they can really minimize when they send the referrer field.
We are.
Okay.
We are looking at that.
Okay.
And yes, it may take more developers. It may take the developers we have to spend more time on it, but I think it's the right thing to do.
I agree.
Yeah.
This is just my point. It needs development resources and creative.
Yeah.
I want to just into mention, Dan said, I've been working on this document with the committee and, press company, but Dan said we're also doing as resident community activity program that's really reference to
Yes.
in this slide deck. And that's about designing for developers, really evaluating working. And I think the concept of thinking in a sense is that to answer directly what you're talking about is a kind of walk, crawl, run approach. We're going to have what we call MSN basics in year one. We're going to figure out privacy. Privacy is one of those elements of the internet. What we're going to do is what we're going to take out of the stock and be able to say this is now a requirement versus the rest of it is going to be something that in future years will be able to integrate. You can't do it all in your month. I totally understand recognition that would be impossible to make for assuming we list of requirements. So we're going to go through and try to sort of stack rank and figure out where we need to go in the first quarter, the second quarter, the third quarter. It is a couple of years process to take a lot of this and to make it actionable for people to think to that standard. And that's our job is to figure out, I think, what the standard is. What is really going to be required, and the rest of it can all be put into the best practices. And you know, it's a lot of months, a lot of years, and we did keep some play there around things that they must do.
Another comment, Lori?
I don't think it's a wonderful document. Now that I have your attention. I think it's a pretty good document. I think it has some gaps and some problems, however. And I'll send you some more comments later.
That would be wonderful.
After discussion. So one that's striking, for example, the document makes a distinction between PII and sensitive PII, and I think that's perfectly legitimate. At the same time, all of the technical development later on pretty much never makes any distinction between the two. So the distinction between the two turns out to be mostly noise. There's only one place where it is thought it actually matters whether it's sensitive or not. And that's a very good thing in the sense that it's so hard to tell if it's sensitive or not that it's good not to depend on it. But all this stuff in sensitive care at the beginning seems kind of a bit
Superfluous.
I think maybe that. Another example of this is that maybe I don't have a correct picture of what's going on after reading the document, but the document seems to say that before any components, even Microsoft components, share any EII, it has to be notice and consent. And if you read that literally, it means that lots of things stop working. And I just can't imagine that
the right guidance.
No, that's not really what we mean there, unfortunately.
What do you mean? What do you want to happen?
Well, it's not whether or not two components on the same machine are sharing information have to get consent from the user first. But if you're sending information to a component that may send it somewhere else, then you need to understand what the obligations are between those components. If component A sends it to B and then B sends it to Microsoft, then B needs to make sure that A was giving notice to the user.
And that's not what the document says. But okay.
Well, then that needs to be cleared up then.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's very much.
Okay, thank you.
I have two comments. One is as far as our Dave's question with other people echoing. It could be that I don't understand what's going on here, but I assume that one of the reasons for doing all this privacy stuff is to reassure Microsoft's customers that their personal information is going to be dealt with in an appropriate way. And the most compelling way you could make that case is if you told them at some level of detail what you're doing. And this document is the most accurate description of what we strive to do. So I can imagine that you just, for the reasons that Scott and others have said, you don't want to give this document out, but you probably want to condense it only slightly, because I take much more comfort knowing some of the detailed ways that you think things should be correlated or not, rather than seeing a one-paragraph thing about how to respect my right to privacy with the campus. It seems like if you're going to go to the trouble of all this privacy stuff for your customers, then you might as well get the credit for it by showing them how much trouble you're going to. And that means putting out a much more detailed document and something that approaches this.
So before you go to your next point, let me just go back to that a little bit. Because in actual fact, this is one actual small, probably insignificant privacy risk in fixed email. It's the subsequent use of data and the subsequent loss of data which actually causes the harm. The point of collection, which in the case of the product is generally what happens. So, but your point's valid. It would be kind of an important piece of the story that we need to have right.
You know, one of the things we really want to focus on while we're on that particular statement is not so much telling the world what we're doing, but showing them. Like, you know, we're going to build applications that are privacy aware. Then there's this fact that here is an application that's privacy aware. When you go to Help menu, there's a privacy statement there. When you go to Tools Options, there's a privacy tab. So we want to show them applications that do protect their privacy.
There's some manifestations of this document that are visible that way. But what you've done is the next step. There are some manifestations of this which are not visible to me as a user. They're hidden. They're things that you're not doing. The code's proprietary, therefore I don't know what your program is doing. But I know when I read this that you're not doing certain things. And those are the things that are visible. Another version of that remark, when I read this, I went into it with the whole wrong idea. I thought it was going to be all about what things Microsoft products have to do, so that people who build software with Microsoft products are more likely to build software that respects the privacy of their customers. And now I realize that when you say privacy, and at least for the purpose of this discussion, it's all about your relationship with your customers. And I see you as a much more leveraged way to get privacy in the world. That is, producing stuff that can be used in a way that will encourage people. So this is part of, if you produce this document, maybe you'll be seen as a leader, but I know you don't want to sign up for more work. There's this whole other area of guidance so that the products that get disseminated will prompt other people to exhibit good privacy practices, whether they have a policy or not, just because of what you're doing now. And so there's that whole second half, and there's a sense in which it's not a bigger piece for you, but it's a much bigger piece for the world, because you hope people are going to be enabled by your software producing.
Yeah, one of the things we want to do is lead by example. And secondly, if we can actually get the certification process changed to include privacy, then that's going to encourage more ISVs who write products for our
You're missing the point here. The third thing is, C# compiler. So nobody can write a program in C#, which they can deploy on their company's enterprise server, which doesn't satisfy this policy.
That'd be hard.
So the whole idea of people, finally, there's a technical thing that I hope you'll clarify. It's on page 10, under basic privacy knowledge. This is a question about determining the correlation with data from other services. And you say if you're collecting user data and it has an ID, then you should figure out what other data sets there are in Microsoft that have that ID, because people might correlate. It's 24, it's actually...
Yes, I have that.
This strikes me as a computational nightmare. Who is going to know about absolutely every data set in the company that has an ID or something that's semantically equivalent to the ID, like my hair color and the town I live in and my last name, and it's going to do that correlation? Are you really signing up for this, or is it something
Well, yeah, as far as physical attributes, I agree. That's almost impossible to track down. But when you look at specific account IDs, now account ID should come into the system or into Microsoft through a particular website or application. And from that viewpoint, we should be able to track it as it moves through Microsoft.
I don't have only a single website with which I deal with Microsoft.
I agree, but I'm saying if you... No, but we shouldn't be using that particular ID in other places. For, say you're going to buy one product on MSN, and you go to that website, and they assign you an account ID for buying cars or car widgets, okay? Then there's an account ID for buying cars at Microsoft. But we shouldn't be using things like IP address, because that could be anywhere. But we shouldn't be reusing account IDs across the, because like you said, it is impossible to track those things down. But without understanding where these account IDs are used, it's almost impossible to understand where the correlation is or the possible leakage of PII could happen.
Well, the sentence says you should understand how data will be correlated with other data.
Yes.
If I'm a customer to you two ways and I have you send all the bills to my home address, you can do a correlation. Doesn't have, I could have two customer IDs, one is with MSN and one with people selling software. You can correlate it on my address. And my reading of this is you're obligated to know about that. And I just don't believe in a company the size of Microsoft. It's a realistic obligation to be incurred.
But it is realistic for them to realize that they use no ID, that probably somebody else in Microsoft used it without knowing exactly what, that it is correlated.
Right. And basically, there's sometimes that I believe in some folks that they're in a closed system, that this ID is only used in the way that they use it in their environment, and they may not be aware that this ID is used in other environments to link sensitive data or PII data. And so one of the things that we found is we need to make people aware of the fact that there are certain cross-company IDs that aren't anonymous with. They may, somebody in their system may have this anonymous data associated with it, but in another environment, PII is. I agree with you. This is the part of the service standard that I think is the most ambitious and it's most more correlation, and it's very much an aspirational thing. I agree that there are going to be times when we very difficult to figure that out.
Okay, so I think we want to try to make this operational. And one way to make it operational is to create some obligation so that somebody can find out where all those data sets are. Or another way is to cast it in a weaker wording so that somebody is obligated to do something they can't do. Just being realistic, otherwise...
Well, the reality is, where it's possible, we do want them to adhere to this. We don't want to lower the bar too much. Now, I understand it's an impossibility in certain standards. You know, if you look at addresses, yes, it's impossible to know where addresses are used across Microsoft. But for specific account IDs that we know of, we can do what we can to separate the information out.
Other people are using the server or site or whatever that's It's really, content that you're taking on board. And it's not just about corporate practices and social.
There's probably a third or subset of the second bucket as well.
Yes.
That unlike many other companies, we just have a responsibility to protect customers' information. Our customers expect us to provide them the technology that helps enable their privacy, their security.
Yeah, if you look at what we did, with SQL Server, we added encryption to it to help people who deploy solutions on top of SQL Server protect information. Also with our CRM application, we added email preferences so people that use our CRM application can help protect or adhere to the email practices of their customers. So we're actually looking at those kinds of things also.
Let me just add one more thing to this discussion. And Fred, this in fact your original point about, maybe we're getting closer to your point as well, and to your point as well about not only taking the leadership role internally with their own development, but how we can potentially influence the people who also deploy other systems that use our technology. I think that's what I heard. One of the things we've been tossing around for quite a while is this concept of the deployment guide for privacy. And it has to do with how you might deploy the server product, for example. And the reason we need to write these things is because theoretically, the people who use our stuff, some have to write their own privacy disclosures, plus have their own policies around privacy for how they use our technologies for information with their customers. And they may not even realize all the things in our system that JC was mentioning that we might have added or controls that they need to set in order to protect their customers' privacy. To the extent the deployment guide suggests things consistent with their own privacy policies, then you start to see influence in how you're suggesting people potentially do it. The problem with that is in the limit, you end up providing legal advice, which is something we can't quite get and do. But that said, even just suggesting that they should be disclosing certain things and maybe not taking such a strong legal position is still a step in the right direction, perhaps. I don't know if I said that properly, but Sue, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm thinking this is what we're talking about in terms of influencing the industry more than just our own product.
Thinking of Section 5, we talked about it a little bit, and it's something that I'm really keen on that actually came out of some work that Jeff and I did, and a lot of that. As I work with the products that I support, I really try to get them to think about when your enterprise customer deploy, what are they going to have to think about in their employee handbook? If they're going to get, or as they serve their end users, what are they going to have to disclose? You can't disclose it for them because you don't have the relationship with the end user. But you really want to help them understand how the product works and what they want to think about without going to the product step and give them legal advice on it to deploy their product internally. Service right that law.
This kind of specific question, just there, things that they come up in different areas. It seems, and I'm not sure why something like it. There's supposed to be these very specific data retention rules set by rec man, and I want to see rec man.
That's records management. Yeah, okay.
But then you say the data goes from the user's machine to your effective period. I haven't really understood. Obviously, the acceptance service accesses that data. Why is it?
Well, the thing is, you are in charge of the information on your computer system. You don't want your files to magically...
But except that users are stupid. We're going to leave stuff there forever. Most people don't even know it's being stored on their machine, right? And so I'm just kind of interested in... It's clearly not because you don't feel you have authority to leave. You think you have authority to put it there.
Well, the thing is, we tend to put the... Okay.
What's the rationale for thinking that there shouldn't be any record management to the extent that you're storing stuff on the user's machine? There should be record management to the extent that you're storing it on Microsoft.
It's about...
To the extent that you're the person, to the extent that Microsoft is the entity storing the data.
Well, it's typically about control. The user wants to have control over their computer systems, their data, and so on. Typically, after a user initiation, the user says, I want to open this, I want to change the color of the desktop, I want to make the communication to Microsoft encrypted versus non-encrypted. Now, once again, they may want cookies because they like a personalized experience when they go to a website. So, it's difficult. I mean, we talked about these kinds of things, and it's difficult to just take actions on the behalf of the user when the data is on their computer system, because then it's hard to rationalize that to the user. It's like, we thought it was a good idea, so we deleted it.
I understand, so you have a little property thing here, but it just feels like.
But where do you draw the line? How do you know when you can delete it and when you can't? It was a real hard one for us.
To the extent that you're actually putting the information there to begin with, I'm not saying you can delete it. It's the question of, do you set a limit? When you put the thing there to begin with, should there be certain record retention policies that are somehow attached to that particular thing?
When you look at logs, cookies, those kinds of things do expire and can go away, because they're not of direct benefit to the user long term. And so those things can roll away. MRU lists, things like that. But other data, it's really hard to determine when it's safe to get rid of those things. Yeah, but logs can be controlled by the user. You can say, well, I'm going to keep logs for a month or a week or forever, roll them out, copy them to new files. So to us, it's giving the user control over whether those things are kept and how long. And we do that with MRU lists, we do it with logs, but we don't do automatic deletion or suppression ourselves. We let the users have the control or the ability to do that for themselves.
But I think part of her point is that I have no idea what is being logged or where or how to have it done. So, and there's no sort of central location for you to go and find out this is your problem.
But we are doing more of that. If you look at what we're doing in Windows XP SP2, there's a privacy statement that gives you the disclosure. We're also looking at having privacy deployment guides. And part of the usage or the reason to have this privacy deployment guide is talk about everything that's being collected, stored, and shared about the user, how to stop it, how to clear it. And so we are moving in that direction.
So there'd be an opportunity for user education as opposed to defining it.
It's not a central tool that
I actually think that there has, to the extent that you're talking about certain kinds of data, right, and say, I don't know what the record retention policies are for data. My sense is that to the extent that you found it important to set limited record retention rates for a privacy reason, but that privacy reason is not necessarily different on your server or on the user server, on the user of the client. My guess would be that because of the security on the client, that to the extent that the record retention policies are weak, the privacy concern is probably much more important that those same kind of record retention policies are enforced on the client. Now, I understand, it sounds like you're saying, well, we feel differently about putting information on the client than we do about taking it away. And, if it's a kind of general concern about the computer being my property, it seems like the concern should be pretty equal if you're shoving something on it or taking it off. I don't know. So I do think that we should look at the information and the record policies and think about them more consistently regardless of who it is. But now, and you may be doing that, this may be the sentence says that. Yes.
Yeah, we tend to lean towards giving the users control more than trying to do it automatically. Now, if we do deploy NSCUB on the user's computer, then we can do more about restricting access. For example, today, if there's something in your file, any application can get access to it, and it's hard for us to stop that, even if you encrypt it.
This ties directly into all the stuff we were talking about, phishing. Phishing is not happening on your server, it's happening on my phone. So, I just think that at least on the record, that breakdown. And there's other things around transfer of data. You talk about delegating, use the word delegate, and I really wonder when you say this authority can be delegated to an administrator or a parent. When I think of delegate as, can you do this for me? And that's not really what you mean.
Correct.
I think it's useful.
Was there a particular context that struck you?
Yeah, it comes up several times, and I think there's a need for probably to understand that delegation is happening. And I don't know how much of that is your obligation versus the obligation of the person who is probably seizing it rather than having to delegate it.
Now you're saying we should clarify to users or to the readers of this document? What do you?
I think probably the users, but I think using the term delegate in the document, it's a little. I don't mean to suggest you're being disingenuous. I just don't think it's really necessary. What you really have to.
Okay.
And the last is that there's a lot of discussion about transfer data to another component, transfer data to enterprise server, transfer data to parent sheet, transfer data to another component, data. And some of those involve transferring data to properties that I no longer physically have control of and transfer, so to your machines. And they all seem to refer back to the same standards that you can share data with another component. And I think that the property issues and the privacy issues that come up with this might merit different rules.
Well, I would hope that they know to which component they're sending data to, and that they can.
Maybe, I don't know.
I mean, if they're just sending it.
More detailed feedback. That's just kind of overarching. It looks to me like these potentially raise really different issues. It makes if it's a component, it's all on my machine, that's one thing. Component, but it's going to somebody, it says to a peer machine. That's a totally different thing. And so it just seems that referring them back to all the same rules, like probably most helpful.
Thank you.
So the only point I wanted to make was a correlation, like and I was thinking that perhaps what we meant by the sentence was not we should understand how, but we should realize that. It doesn't suggest any kind of operational obligation, but I don't really know. The correlation one was the one that was disturbing me because you can have lots of anonymous data stored in different places and still identify the person. And then, how are you going to then, in your second paragraph, downgrade that label? There's nowhere else you can downgrade it to.
Yeah, I agree. That's a hard problem.
I mean, this whole section around correlation and the services is an attempt to deal with this whole problem that you see more in the internet where pages are used, and we want to have those privacy around data, but at the same time we can't help but capture often using just the TCAAB unique, identifiers that are then going to be used to assist us serve off pages or do whatever. And we're trying to find a way around the whole issue of unique ID. And passport is one, and a lot of it might come up with this kind of think about internally what is the right way to handle the whole problem of unique ID. Understanding that the CAI is associated with ID and everything else is also with AI, sort of fundamental bedrock privacy. So it's just an attempt to sort through something. And it's very much in its draft form. This is bad,
Yeah, but the problem is you're focusing on IDs.
yes, yes, but they're non-unique IDs.
Data.
Address.
That can correlate instead of. I mean, I think you're talking about. But unique ID you need is like where.
Right. That's what we're trying to do is figure out how to use unique IDs, separate out the away from to be able to use them and not they're not associated with the AI. That's kind of the goal.
It didn't mix it up with this and data correlation. And all of that has a policy that gives people time to identify.
Right. That is supposed to be.
Right, I'm not here.
Well, that policy is just.
Laura, did you have a question? Are you stretching or?
Yeah, it's not ours, unfortunately. There's a full bar later on, but if you do that, you're gonna have a bunch of angry Latin Americans coming out in here. So
I'll also be at dinner tonight in case you have any questions that you want to ask me later on.
we've got a pretty big show.
I do want to go back to your statement about making public and so on.
Yes.
I think there was, I like that idea, but I can also understand from your point of raising expectation. That when the Trustworthy Community Initiative first launched, January 2001 or whatever it was, you raised the customer's expectations to the point where when I returned to see you, they said to me, right after slap or watch, whatever it is, how come they got rid of all those fires? So, people, there's this balance. Besides the legal problems, there's still,
Yeah, expectations.
because especially you're saying some of these high aspirations that you write down here, and if that gets out to the public, and there's going to be
Absolutely right. Anybody else?
Jason, I wanted to ask a group of questions. Is that allowed?
Oh, of course.
Is anybody aware, I mean, we really did spend a lot of time on this, and we're looking for what other guidance out there. Is anybody aware of the privacy standards, open internet development software that exists elsewhere? One of the things that, we want to actually leverage other research and thought or academic work on this subject, and I'm just curious if people had any insights along those lines.
Well, I'm sure Peter is familiar with, there's the stuff that was done and participated in Department of Justice, developing guidelines. I mean, part of the development, but more of it is aimed towards having products disseminated. But privacy guidelines, you know what I'm talking about?
It was part of their privacy impact assessment effort by the
Okay,
Yeah, and they did it in conjunction with the data protection. And they're pretty detailed and useful. Yeah, they're slightly different in this, but they do have more questions. That's the only other kind of process that
I think there's an overlap with privacy impact assessments that exist in various places. OMB has guidance on it now under the E-Government Act of 2002. The IRS has the longest running one. New Zealand has them now. The Dutch Data Protection Authority has privacy. So I think if you sort of sample all those, you'll see maybe an overlap with some things. But I'm not aware of any software development set of guidelines. How do you write the code? People have talked about it as something that's desirable, but I've never seen it.
Well, of course, back to Dave's point, if it's an open source, well, you don't need to have standards, they're open.
Well, there hasn't been any very serious public place that's happened.
There's surprisingly little certification program.
But there is one other, if IBM were willing to talk to you, if they were developing their typically these products which have a privacy component, you might find that they've worked through some of this in more detail.
Well, I know they have a privacy practice at IBM, but I don't know much about what they're espousing,
But they've done some work in turn there.
Actually, they also they did some research about privacy preserving database, which would be no requirement of DBMS in order to achieve privacy. Like, for example, keeping metadata, which will tell the purpose of the data, and many other. And actually, there are a lot of other papers. I can tell you.
Please do, yeah.
Everybody ready for a break?